My name's Phil Sanders. I'm a research fellow at the University of Auckland. Today I'm going to talk about some of the work I did for my recently completed PhD project, Multisensory Integration as a Measure of Plasticity and Cognitive Aging, and I'll unpack these terms as we go. A common consequence of aging is a decline in both sensory and cognitive abilities. So not only does our hearing and vision become worse over time, but certain mental tasks can become slower too. There's a body of research that suggests that sensory and cognitive decline are linked in some way, but the nature of this relationship remains unclear. Brain plasticity, which is the ability of the brain to change in response to experience, also declines with age. So remembering and learning new things can get harder too. I wanted to see if declining plasticity could help to explain the relationship between age-related sensory and cognitive decline, and whether plasticity could be harnessed to help fight these age-related declines. Connections between neurons can change, getting stronger or weaker depending on the relative activity of the neurons. This is known as activity-dependent plasticity. So I also wanted to examine whether age-related declines in the induction of plasticity could be countered by taking advantage of multisensory processing, as this can enhance activity relative to unisensory stimulation. Let's look at multisensory processing in more detail. Multisensory processing describes how the brain sorts out information from the different senses and decides which signals belong together and which should be separated. So imagine a ball bouncing. Light reflects off the ball, enters your eyes, and is processed by your brain, allowing you to see the ball. At the moment the ball hits the ground, it also creates vibrations that travel through the air, into your ears, and are processed by your brain, allowing you to hear the bounce. Although light and sound travel at different speeds, you perceive the sight and sound of the ball hitting the ground as simultaneous and as one event. So your brain has corrected for the differences in arrival times of the two signals and bound them together. This is an example of a perceptual outcome of neural processes known as multisensory integration. Multisensory integration can produce interesting effects at neural and perceptual levels. So-called multisensory neurons exist in the brain that respond to more than one modality. In this example, the neuron shows a small response when a visual stimulus is presented and a larger response when an auditory stimulus is presented. One might think that if the auditory and visual stimuli were presented together, then the response would be the sum of the unisensory responses, and this is what the additive model predicts. However, multisensory neurons often show responses that are greater than the additive model predicts. This is known as superadditivity, and it is one of the possible effects of multisensory integration. Integration can also result in sub-additive responses that are smaller than the additive model's prediction. At a perceptual level, multisensory integration can produce performance benefits. For example, people are often faster to respond to a visual target if it is accompanied by a sound than if it is presented alone. These benefits are usually greater for older people than young people. The spatial relationships and timing between the component stimuli that make up a multimodal stimulus can modulate integration effects. So generally, effects are greater the closer together in time and space that the signals occur, although the perceptual system does have some tolerance for small offsets. Let's return now to my project. So to guide the theory, design, and interpretation of my work, I reviewed literature from the sensory plasticity and multisensory processing fields. I'm not going to go into these reviews here, but I'll add some suggestions for further reading at the end of this webinar for those that are interested. In the first experiment that I'll talk about, I looked at a putative form of plasticity that's induced with sensory stimuli and measured with visual evoked potentials derived from EEG or brainwave data. In the second experiment, I used multisensory processing and electrophysiology to probe sensory plasticity and its relationship to cognition. To record visual evoked potentials, a participant's brainwaves are measured while they view a repeating visual stimulus. Each time a stimulus is presented, the corresponding time point on the EEG is marked. Epochs of time around the stimulus presentations are then extracted and averaged together to produce evoked potential waveforms. To examine plasticity, I adapted an existing paradigm where visual evoked potentials are recorded while a stimulus is presented at a slow rate. The stimulus is then presented at a much faster rate. This high-frequency stimulation is called visual tetanization. Previous studies reported that when visual evoked potentials were measured post-tetanization, they showed increased amplitudes compared to baseline in the N1B component, which is this area marked with the yellow box. These changes were called potentiation and are thought to reflect a type of activity-dependent plasticity induced by the visual tetanus in the visual cortex. So my experiment included two groups, older and younger adults. Half of each group underwent the visual tetanization paradigm. For the other half, the tetanus was multimodal, so a beep was presented simultaneously with each visual stimulus presentation during tetanization. Visual evoked potentials were recorded before and after tetanization in both conditions. I analyzed changes in the N1B component and the N1 to P2 peak-to-peak amplitudes between groups and conditions. So that N1 to P2 measure is between there and there. The N1B component didn't show any significant changes after tetanization or between groups, but the N1 to P2 measure produced some interesting results. As this bar graph illustrates, after visual tetanization, the direction and amount of N1 to P2 change differed significantly between the age groups. Yet after multimodal tetanization, the elderly showed similar responses to the young. This supported the idea that multimodal stimulation can enhance sensory plasticity in the elderly and mitigate age-related differences observed after visual stimulation. I should note here that the groups tested were quite small, and so replication of these effects will be required to confirm these effects. Experiment 2 was different. 40 older adults participated, and there were 3 parts to the experiment. So I still included visual tetanization, which provided an electrophysiological measure of sensory plasticity. I also used an auditory visual simultaneity judgment training paradigm, which was a measure of, or a perceptual measure of sensory plasticity, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a minute. And then a set of cognitive tests from a test battery called the NIH Toolbox. I thought that if plasticity did underlie the link between sensory and cognitive decline in older people, then a relationship between these measures should be evident. In each trial of the simultaneity judgment task, participants were presented with a beep and a flash. They had to decide whether the two stimuli occurred simultaneously or not. In some trials, the beep came before the flash, and in others, the flash was first. And yet, In others, the stimuli were synchronous. In the asynchronous trials, the gap between the stimuli varied between 50 and 300 milliseconds. So the closer together in time that the stimuli were presented, the more likely they were to be perceived as occurring simultaneously. From the participants' responses, I could then create curves, like these ones, which indicated the probability of the perception of synchrony at different time gaps. A temporal binding window was then estimated. So this is the window of time in which two stimuli have to fall in order to be perceived as a single event. Now the width of the window is estimated as the length of time between the 2 points where a criterion line crosses the curves, which is shown as a dashed line in this example here. So that space in there in milliseconds. My participants did this task without knowing whether their answers were correct or not, before and after a training period. During the training period, they did the task with feedback after each trial, and it indicated whether the answer was correct or not. Training was expected to lead to improved sensitivity to asynchrony, as indexed by a narrowing of the temporal binding window after training compared to baseline. I predicted that the three measures in this experiment would be correlated, and that participants who showed greater plasticity, a narrowing of the temporal binding window, and potentiation of the visual evoked potential, would have higher scores on the cognitive battery than those who showed less plasticity. So greater plasticity would be indexed by a narrowing of the temporal binding window and potentiation of the visual evoked potential. My hypothesis was not supported, but there were some interesting results. N1B potentiation was observed after visual tetanization, but showed no relationship with cognition or simultaneity judgment task improvements. Post-training changes to temporal binding window width did correlate with cognitive scores, suggesting a relationship between auditory visual temporal sensitivity and cognition. However, the direction of the relationship was opposite to what I had expected. So on the y-axis of this chart, the negative numbers indicate a narrowing of the temporal binding window, or improved sensitivity to the temporal offsets. So as the chart shows, it was the participants who scored lower on the cognition battery that improved most on the simultaneity judgment task. This result was counterintuitive. However, if the sensory and cognitive systems probed in the study declined together, then those who performed poorly on the tasks would have the most room for improvement. And so training would produce greater improvements than for those who were already performing well to begin with, and who may actually get worse on the task due to fatigue or criterion shifts. Improvements on the simultaneity judgment task and N1B potentiation both suggested that plasticity was evident in this sample of older people. This suggests that older people could benefit from training paradigms to improve sensory ability and possibly cognitive ability as well. The interventions used in my thesis are unlikely to have far-reaching effects, as they target very specific low-level processes. However, they do indicate the potential for plasticity in older people. Responses to low-level processes may indicate whether people will be receptive to higher-level training. Training targeted to higher-level and more general processes may have more real-world benefits. Even if cognitive training is unsuccessful, sensory training may help to improve cognition by alleviating the cognitive load and freeing up resources otherwise expended on sensory processing. So, to summarize, my results suggest that multimodal stimulation enhanced the induction of plasticity in older adults compared to visual stimulation. Sensory tetanization effects did suggest the potential for plasticity in my elderly samples, but the functional role of these effects remains elusive. A link between multisensory processing and cognition was suggested, but plasticity did not appear to explain it. However, my results suggest that plasticity can be harnessed to improve perception and may also be useful in fighting cognitive decline. So here's a few starting points for reading for anyone who'd like to know more about these fields and where some of these ideas came from. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge my supervisors, Associate Professor Grant Searchfield and Associate Professor Paul Corbelis, and Professor Ben Thompson. I'd also like to acknowledge my funders, Brain Research New Zealand and the Hope Sullivan Foundation, and of course all of my participants, and the Easel Moore Centre for the opportunity to present this work. Thanks for listening.